I'm going to welcome to meeting number 43 of the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using Zoom. We are in committee business. I have two items for discussion today. One small point. First, you will have all received the study budget to be adopted for the two meetings the committee had in relation to the main estimates. Is it the will of the committee to adopt the budgets for $500? I see consensus on that, Madam Clerk. We have consensus. Second point is that we are resuming debate on the motion moved by Michael Barrett on Thursday, April 23rd, as already amended, that the committee require the Privy Council office to provide the committee on a quarterly basis with a report detailing each time an assessment was undertaken relating to the application of the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen. Pursuant to the assessment tool on the application of the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen, including assessments originating in the PCO or any department from previous month, that these reports include a summary of each instance where an assessment was triggered. Number two, the record of the outcome of each analysis. 3, any records of discussions or considerations that are in the possession of the PCO or any department related to each analysis, including notes and meeting minutes. And 4, any correspondence related to each analysis, including emails, text messages, instant messages, and other records of conversations, and that the first report shall be provided to the committee by no later than June 15th, 2026, and shall include the complete set of information for each assessment since the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen came into effect. B, post the reports publicly on the committee's website. And C, invite the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner every quarter to discuss the contents of the most recent quarterly report from the PCO. And then there was an amendment that was moved by Ms. Chagger, that the motion be amended by replacing the words, an assessment was undertaken relating to the application of the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen pursuant to the assessment tool on the application of the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen, including assessments originating in the PCO or any department from where the previous month, that these reports include 1, a summary of each instance where an assessment was triggered. 2, the record of the outcome of each analysis. 3, any records of discussions or considerations that are in the possession of the PCO or any department related to each analysis, including notes and meeting minutes. And 4, any correspondence related to each analysis, including emails, text messages, instant messages, and other records of conversations, and that the first report shall be provided to the committee by no later than June 15th, 2026, and shall include with the complete set of information for each assessment since the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen came into effect. And that was to be replaced with the words, the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen has been applied, given that the Conflict of Interest Commissioner has advised the Prime Minister against learning of when the screen has been applied until the decision has been finalized and made public. Such decisions shall be shared after this point, subject to any limitations or privileges that may apply, such as the national security or cabinet confidence. And 2, by adding the following. Require the Privy Council office to provide the committee as necessary any updates to the assessment process for applying the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen. And on the sub-amendment, which we are on right now, moved by Mr. Barrett, that the amendment be amended by adding in Part 1 of the amendment after the words the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen has been applied, the words or not applied following the assessment. So this is where we resume debate today. It's on the sub-amendment moved by Mr. Barrett, that the amendment be amended by adding in Part 1 of the amendment after the words the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest screen has been applied, the words or not applied following the assessment. Mr. Hardy, I have you first, suivi par Madame Goudreau et Monsieur Cooper après ça. Mr. Hardy, on the sub-amendment, please go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je suis content d'être de retour aujourd'hui.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to be back. I have to be careful to not touch the microphone. Just give me a second. I did that so well. I'm happy to be with you today because I think that we're discussing something that is essential to democracy, and that's transparency and accountability. We proposed a motion which is very simple, and I want us to focus on the history of what's going on. And I want everyone to understand our proposal so that people who are watching understand what's going on. I want them to see the evolution of our discussions, and I want them to understand, or maybe they won't understand, why our Liberal colleagues are refusing this proposal. The Privy Council office, well, we're asking them to come quarterly, on a quarterly basis, and to let us know every time the screen is used. The screen has to be used because we have a Prime Minister who has goods in, or rather shares in over 200 companies, and we want to ensure that all of the decisions that are made here in this country are made for Canadians in their best interest and not in order to benefit himself. It's essential. The international economy is changing, and Canadians need to know that decisions that are made by their elected officials are made for them. So the screen exists because there are 2,000 businesses and 1,900 that are not covered by the screen, 103 that are covered by the screen. This screen is administered by direct employees of the Prime Minister. And we're an oversight committee. It's normal that we want to know when this screen has been used. We want to perhaps ask questions and just to ensure that everything was done properly. If these are direct employees of the Prime Minister who are having to apply this, there could be a potential conflict of interest. Our proposal is very clear. We want the report to be provided. We want to know when the screen was used. We want to know what the results are of the analysis. This information should be accessible. We want to have access to documents, the minutes, communication, and we want the committee to be able to review it. It's not on an individual basis as members. We want the entire committee to be able to look at this information. That's important because we're asking for transparency. Point B, we want this report to be made public. We want people to be aware of what's happening, and we want the commissioner to come on a quarterly basis. We want him to give us some of his time so that we can review the analyses that were carried out. So, we have tabled this motion here. And things have been blocked ever since the colleagues across the room became a majority government. We're trying to make a proposal, and they have proposed the removal of 75% of what was in our motion. So clearly, they don't want Canadians and Quebecers to have access to information regarding what's happening. They don't want them to have access to these analyses that should be carried out for them. Being told that the screen was used without any additional information, and the Liberals have talked about national security reasons. So asking questions now is dangerous? What is going on? This is not complicated. We have a Prime Minister who is at the head of the country. He's making decisions that have a significant impact on the economy and on the bottom line for Canadians and Quebecers. And this can also have a significant impact on his own wallet. And we want to be sure that decisions are always made for the right reasons. But we're being told that for national security reasons, then Canadians can't know how their money is being used. You talked about an as-need basis. Who's going to decide that this report needs to be given to us? You are seeking to add as needed, so you're trying to decide what the committee should be looking at? It's not up to or you're saying that it's not up to the oversight committee to decide what we need to look at, but rather that you, the Liberal Party, should decide what we need to look at. We are trying to work together regardless of that, and so we propose a sub-amendment. This sub-amendment is seeking information on when the screen was used and when it was not. If it's direct employees of the screen who are implementing it, they're also the ones who decide when it's not used. And if the decision was to not use the screen, we want to know what the discussion was, what led to that decision. The opposition plays an important role. We want to protect Canadians and be a counterbalance. So it's important that we are heard, especially when we're talking about billions of dollars being invested and we're being told not to ask questions. Today, we were called conspiracy theorists because we're asking questions and we want information. Apparently, that makes us conspiracy theorists. We're tired of being told that we're not asking the right questions. We were given information regarding the tool. It's interesting. There are a lot of relevant elements to it. So this is the ethics screen here. And I just want to remind you of something important. We've been told from the beginning that this screen is very efficient because the Prime Minister doesn't know what his holdings are. Everything was put in a blind trust. And so, perhaps the person that is in charge of that trust has sold everything and he wouldn't know. And so the Liberals are saying that the Prime Minister is not aware. It's impossible that he could tell the trustee what to do. He did not share his intentions on what he wanted to do with his shares, his vision, his long-term vision for Brookfield, that all of that was set aside when he became Prime Minister, and that because there's a screen and because he put all of his shares into a blind trust, everything is protected now because he all of a sudden no longer knows what he has, no longer knows the direction that Brookfield is going to take. And now you've put in place this ethics screen with the Ethics Commissioner, which is to be triggered when Brookfield is impacted, or one of those 2,000 businesses, or one of the 105. I need to go back to my notes. One of the 103 out of 2,000 of those businesses when they're part of the equation. And Brookfield, as we know, is continuing to invest in many things. The Director of Operations came to tell us that when Brookfield makes money, well, then the Prime Minister gets wealthier. And things are going very well for Brookfield. They're always around. There are always interactions. And most projects that you are focusing on right now are part of Brookfield's catalog. Brookfield invests in those industries. So let's look at the screen. And remember that Mr. Sabia, who is one of the people responsible for this screen, sold all of his shares to not be at a conflict of interest, or in a conflict of interest, rather. And so in order to do his job, he thought it would be important to sell all of his shares in order to meet the expectations set for him. In all of the announcements made by the Prime Minister, he says that there are major changes never before seen, but apparently that's not important enough to sell all of his shares and to clarify to Canadians that he's making decisions that are supposed to benefit them. Now, in all of this, the Commissioner has said that the screen is efficient. So the screen has relevant elements. The commissioner, the ethics commissioner, and I, as the Prime Minister, designed this ethics screen which seeks to prevent any kind of favoritism to Brookfield Management Corporation and Stripe, and any other business owned by Brookfield. So it's quite vast. So he's saying that it's only the things that he is aware of. You'll be able to find that in Annex A, but unfortunately we don't have access to Annex A. So we don't know what all of the businesses are. So it's easy to make these documents that end up trying to say, look at how good things are going, but you can't see anything. You can't ask any questions because then you'll be threatening national security. So it's an interesting time. But if we come back to the amendment, I think that what we're requesting is very normal. All we want to know is when the screen is used and what the mechanisms were. We want to know when it was decided that the screen was not used. As a committee, as a neutral committee, we have the right to ask these relevant questions in order to inform Canadians regarding decisions made by the Prime Minister and on the billions of dollars that are spent every week. So I find it interesting that yet again today we are dealing with the colleagues across the room who are refusing. And not only are they refusing, they are proposing the removal of 75% of our motion. And they give as an excuse that we're asking for too much and that this is a national security risk, that we're exaggerating. So again, you're showing that transparency is not your goal. So you went in camera at the very beginning of your majority government. Your first reflex was to close the cameras, turn off the cameras. And now that we're asking for more clarity, we're asking to work on behalf of Canadians and Quebecers, and you're refusing any kind of transparency. You don't want any accountability. We're conspiracy theorists. We are causing threats to the national security when we ask questions. I think that Canadians and Quebecers can make their own opinions, and I hope that you'll hear reason. You're not here for yourselves. You're here for Canadians. Not everyone agrees with you, and they have a right to know why decisions are made. And that's just being neutral. It's being efficient. It's being transparent. And that's our role. We're here to serve Canadians. Institutions are here to serve people, not themselves. We don't want people using our institutions to benefit themselves. And that needs to be clear for Canadians. That's how we'll be able to rebuild trust. We have heard from countless witnesses that people are no longer trusting their institutions, and the only way to build back that trust is to overcorrect, to go 100% in another direction and be entirely transparent. That's all I have to say on our sub-amendment, Chair. Hopefully my colleagues hear reason, and quickly. Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Ms. Gaudreau, on the sub-amendment. Chair, Mr. Thériault is not here today, and I'm replacing him here, but I think that the AI minister will be tabling a strategy next week, and the committee worked hard on that. There were a lot of recommendations that were made. I think that it would have been great for the report to be tabled before we received the strategy. So the committee had the draft report, but is there a way for the committee to table this report in the House? Yes.
Schedule some time in order to make sure that we do the draft consideration of the report. You're quite right that it has been distributed. I am trying to work with the clerk to find some time to do that as soon as possible. We haven't landed on that as yet because we are still in the middle of the lobbying study. There are witnesses that are scheduled for that next week, and then of course the minister is coming with the ethics commissioner for Alto on June 11th. We already determined that, so it's likely that we may end up dealing with this in the fall when we come back. Madame Goudreau, merci.
OK. Et sur le sous-amendement, Monsieur le Président,
And on the sub-amendment, Chair, I was part of the Ethics Committee from 2019 to 2021. We're dealing with another catastrophe. We're trying to focus on prevention. I remember the first motion that I tabled at Ethics. I was requesting that the finance minister, Mr. Morneau, step down because he had not recused himself. You might remember the We Charity scandal from 2020 for $48,000. And what happened? He stepped down, and then Mr. Morneau went to the OECD. Everyone knows. Everyone knows what the Prime Minister's interests are. A banker, he's a businessman, a shareholder. When I speak to the people of my riding in Laurentides-Labelle, they are more than cynical. They are even wondering if we have safeguards to ensure that there is transparency, and they're very discouraged. And I have to say these things. I am not looking for power. If I was in your shoes, if I had to protect the Prime Minister, and I had to say, don't worry, there won't be a scandal, I mean, people are smarter than that. And then I am trying to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks. I'm looking at this motion. I can see that we have a very prescriptive guideline. I can see that a major change was made. I'm not sure that there won't be any gaps, but we need to find a middle ground. The Ethics Committee is a committee that can't have a lot of partisanship. Yes, of course, there will always be filibustering. With the We Charity, there was 44 hours of filibustering. But we need to show Canadians that we have a spine. We need to show them that we want to protect their interests. And we're not talking about $48,000 that led to Mr. Morneau stepping down. We want to prevent problems. When I go home, I hear from the people in my riding, and they ask me, what is he afraid of? If you're not afraid of anything, you're open to sharing information. And organizations are telling us that they have accountability requirements for $48, or else they'll see their grants removed and they'll have to close up shop. They find it insulting. So I can't imagine that we wouldn't be able to find a balance here. I didn't have the numbers in front of me, but when I see 2,000 companies that he's a shareholder of and the times where the ethics screen has been used, I can't believe it. And what I've done at the Procedures Committee and at the Government Operations Committee, I think that Mr. Barrett was there, yes, but at Proc, Mr. Cooper was there. And we often took a break so that we could discuss all of this to ensure that we were aligned. Because I get the impression that this filibuster is going to carry on and we don't have a lot of time left. And Chair, I think we need to find a solution. What is there to hide? The answer might be that there's nothing to hide. And if that's the case, well, what's happening now doesn't make any sense. Thank you, Ms. Goudreau. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to speak to the sub-amendment put forward by Mr. Barrett. I want to take a step back to provide some context as to what it is that is before this committee. The sub-amendment put forward by Mr. Barrett calls on and would mandate that the Prime Minister's Office, Privy Council Office, disclose to the committee every time that a decision is made with respect to the Prime Minister's ethics screen. Now, it's important to note that with respect to the ethics screen, that this was a screen that was set up at the insistence of the Ethics Commissioner in the face of the Prime Minister's extensive conflicts related to primarily, but not exclusively, to Brookfield. Now, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council last fall came before this committee and provided the assurance that the screen was being robustly used and that an assessment tool was created within the PCO and the PMO to guide the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, both of whom are charged with the responsibility of administering the screen, to be able to do so effectively. And the assessment tool that they provided a copy of to this committee, they tabled before this committee, contains an analysis, a step-by-step analysis. It sets out the matters that must be included in the screen, and the matters that must be included relate to any direct engagement by Brookfield Asset Management, Brookfield Corporation, or Stripe Inc., and the companies listed in Annex A of the Prime Minister's Conflict of Interest Screen. In other words, the companies in which the Prime Minister has declared a conflict in relation to. Now, we know that the Prime Minister has other conflicts that are not in the screen that he didn't disclose, but that's a separate issue. There are 103 companies or 103 conflicts listed in Annex A. So the matters that must be included in the screen relate to any direct engagement with respect to those companies listed. The tool that the PCO and PMO designed then goes on to provide or set out the matters requiring assessment. And the tool notes that certain sectors warrant specific attention, including real estate, mortgage, insurance, the airline industry, the expansion of the nuclear industry, the expansion and investment in the renewable energy sector, including solar, wind, and hydro, as well as the credit card industry. So then, upon identifying is one of the listed companies captured by a matter that could be put before or a matter in which the Prime Minister could be engaged in? And does it particularly relate to any of these areas where, given the Prime Minister's declared interests, he has interests in relation to real estate, mortgage insurance, the airline industry, the nuclear industry, the renewable energy sector, the credit card industry, those sectors that have been specifically identified as red flags? There is then an analysis that is undertaken if it is triggered, and that is with the threshold question: what is the Prime Minister's involvement? What decision is being sought from the Prime Minister? What matter is he being asked to discuss or engage on? And then, so that's the threshold question. That's what must be answered. And the tool then provides matters that must be included in the screen. Does the decision or discussion involve direct engagement between Brookfield Asset Management, Brookfield Corporation, Stripe Inc., or any of the companies listed in Annex A and the Government of Canada, example, contracting for goods and services, applications for funding, meetings, and then matters requiring assessment? Are the interests of one of the companies involved in the decision or discussion? And if so, in what way? Is the decision or discussion in relation to a matter of general application? Does the decision or discussion involve the interests of at least one of the companies as a member of a broad class of persons or entities? If the decision or discussion applies to a broad class, is the interest/benefit of at least one of the companies disproportionate to those of the other members? Another question: if the decision or discussion is one not of general application and does not apply to a broad class, or two, there is a disproportionate interest/benefit despite being applicable to a broad class, is there a direct link between the Prime Minister's involvement and the opportunity to further one of the company's interests? And then the tool provides examples to assist with the assessment. And examples include questions of a general application, such as if the decision or discussion applies to an undetermined group of people or companies, then the matter is of general application. If the decision or a discussion applies to a regulated activity and to an indefinite group, then the matter is not of a general application. If the decision or discussion applies to a particular entity, person, or group of entities or persons, or to a particular situation, then the matter is not of general application. Further examples to assist with the assessment include questions related to a broad class. So in those questions include if the decision or discussion applies to a large number of entities or people who may have different characteristics but share at least one important characteristic, such as teachers, homeowners, lawyers, financial services companies, etc., then the matter applies to a broad class. If the decision or discussion applies to a small group, then the matter does not apply to a broad class. If the decision or discussion applies to a larger group, but one of the companies has a disproportionate interest/benefit, then the matter does not apply to a broad class. A disproportionate interest/benefit refers to an imbalance in proportion to others. So this is the tool that is being used. These are the questions that are supposedly being analyzed to determine whether a matter should be put or can appropriately be put before the Prime Minister, or whether it should not be put in front of the Prime Minister, whether the matter be kept at arm's length from the Prime Minister. And for the purpose, we were told, of transparency and accountability, this analysis is documented. It's documented in a 2-page template that is filled in, and upon that 2-page analysis, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council make a decision as to whether the screen applies or does not apply. And if they can't make a decision, then they pursuant to the tool, or seek more information. I mean, those are the 3 options. Either they can make a decision that it applies or it doesn't apply, or they need further information. And then if in the event that they request further information, then presumably that information is then provided, and then a decision, yes or no, is made. Now, the motion, or the sub-amendment of Mr. Barrett, simply provides that this committee be able to see these 2-page analyses that are conducted every time that there is a red flag being that the Prime Minister may have a conflict of interest in relation to a matter. Not that he does, but that he might. And what the Liberals seem to be prepared to do is to say, well, we'll provide you with the times in which the screen is invoked, that a determination is made that the Prime Minister has a conflict on a matter that isn't of a general application, that kicks in, of course, when a decision disproportionately impacts Brookfield's interests relative to other companies as part of a broad class or otherwise. But we won't provide you with the times that this form is filled out and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of Privy Council say, no, we don't believe that the Prime Minister has a conflict and can engage on the matter, even though the matter would have to involve Brookfield or one of the companies listed in Annex A, which relate to companies in which he has a declared conflict in relation to. And it's really unclear as to what the rationale is in terms of why the Liberals seem to so strongly want to resist this, I think, common sense sub-amendment from Mr. Barrett that would go a long way to providing transparency that Canadians deserve in knowing that the Prime Minister is not making decisions where he has a conflict of interest, to have the assurance that the ethics screen, which is supposedly a safeguard to prevent the Prime Minister from engaging in matters in which he has a conflict of interest, is being invoked appropriately. And frankly, if the Prime Minister really wants to stand behind the ethics screen, and if we're to accept that everything has been done in such a robust way, then I would have thought that the Prime Minister's office and Liberals on the committee would be very eager to say, here it is. Here are the times that red flags have been raised. here is the analysis that was undertaken, and in light of the analysis, here is the decision that was made by the Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, one way or another. Yes, it's good to know the times that the Prime Minister has, I wouldn't say recuse himself, because under the ethics screen it's designed so that the Prime Minister, that it isn't supposedly put in front of the Prime Minister, so he wouldn't have to recuse himself. He would supposedly have no idea that this matter was before his government. And he would be, if it were used in the way that Prime Minister's office, the Clerk of the Privy Council say it's designed to do, and as the Ethics Commissioner asked that it be designed to do, it would be to completely shield the Prime Minister from those decisions. So fine, we need to know when that happens, but I would argue that as relevant, if not more relevant, are to know the times that there was a red flag that was issued and the decision was made that the Prime Minister could weigh in, even though it relates to a matter in which he has some sort of declared conflict, in all likelihood related to Brookfield, not necessarily, but in all likelihood given the companies and entities that are listed in Annex A. We haven't, I've spoken a few times to this yesterday, or at the last meeting on Monday, and I said several times to the Liberal members, if there's something that I'm missing here, something that would clearly explain why it is that it's impossible, or that there's something problematic about disclosing the times that a decision is made by the Chief of Staff and the Clerk, the Prime Minister doesn't have a conflict that rises to the threshold to invoke the ethics screen, to provide what those reasons are. But no reasons have been offered, or at least to the degree that some rationale has been put forward, it would seem to be completely inadequate in terms of an explanation as to why this committee shouldn't be made aware of the times that a decision is made to not invoke the ethics screen in the face of a red flag relating to a conflict. One of the explanations that was provided was that it was cumbersome. That word might not have been precisely been used, but that was effectively one of the arguments that was put. And it's not clear to me how it could be cumbersome, because we know that back in the fall, when the Clerk and Chief of Staff came before this committee as we undertook a review of the Conflict of Interest Act, we were told that the screen had been, the tool had been triggered 13 times in which a decision had to be made about whether to apply the screen or not apply the screen, and that on seven occasions a decision was made, I believe, not to invoke the screen, and 6 times the decision was made to invoke the screen, or it could have been the reverse of that. But there were 13 occasions when there had been a red flag and a decision one way or another had been made. So that would have been, as of the fall, documents that amount to being 26 pages, 13 different summations, 13 different occasions where the Chief of Staff and the Clerk signed off on the tool to answer the question ultimately, do you concur that this issue engages or does not engage the application of the Prime Minister's conflict of interest screen? So what is cumbersome about that? What is difficult about that? Now, we know, in terms of the update that has been provided to this committee, that, not surprisingly, the other conflicts have been flagged, given that other decisions have come forward, and that there were 14 occasions where the screen had been applied. That a decision was made that, yes, in fact, it does engage the Prime Minister's application of conflict of interest screen, and therefore he should be shielded from having any knowledge or any involvement in respect of the matter. I would not, if it were in the fall, a total of 13 matters that came before the clerk and the chief of staff, and now there were 14 times when it was applied after several months had passed. We're not talking. We couldn't be talking about hundreds of other occasions where there was a red flag. We're probably talking about 14, 15, maybe 20 times, maybe 10 times that a decision was made that no, the screen does not apply. So the notion that it is somehow burdensome is just not genuine. It's not a reasonable explanation for saying that we as a committee, an oversight committee, the ethics committee, shouldn't be privy to knowing the occasions when a decision is made that the screen not be invoked. Another argument that was put forward was, and again I'm paraphrasing, but in essence it was, well, that's just not how it works. That's not how it works. I'm sorry. It's not how it works. The Liberal member said, well, there's the Ethics Commissioner, Conflict of Interest Act. If there are matters that arise in which it is thought that the screen should have been invoked, whereby the Prime Minister was in a conflict, that there is the Ethics Commissioner there, and that there is a process in place through the Ethics Commissioner to deal with breaches of the Conflict of Interest Act. And yeah, that's true. We do have an Ethics Commissioner, but it goes without saying that it becomes difficult, more difficult, for members of Parliament, opposition members of the Liberal members, if assuming that they also are interested in oversight, as members of this committee, to work to provide appropriate oversight when there isn't full and complete transparency. How can one scrutinize whether the Prime Minister was in a conflict or not a conflict when it's entirely possible, absent disclosure, that members of this committee and Canadians are left in the dark about decisions that he may in fact be involved in making? So to say that there is a process and that there's an ethics commissioner, and if there's the possibility that the act was violated will write to the ethics commissioner. The ethics commissioner can undertake an investigation. That isn't an adequate explanation for that either. And if we were to accept the submissions of the clerk and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, the whole purpose of the ethics screen is to avoid exactly that type of scenario. And I take it that's exactly what the screen is supposed to do, prevent breaches of the Act. But if we don't know when red flags have been raised and decisions are made that the Prime Minister can proceed, then there's a major transparency gap. A major transparency gap. One that the sub-amendment put forward by Mr. Barrett seeks to close. And I would cite the Ethics Commissioner in his annual report for 2023-24, in which he states at paragraph 22, or page 22 rather, quote, transparency is a pillar of the Conflict of Interest Act and indeed of all effective conflict of interest regimes. End of quote. Precisely. Precisely. In order for there to be confidence that the ethics screen is being applied appropriately, there has to be transparency. And what the Liberals are saying is that we'll give you transparency selectively, but we won't give you transparency in those cases where there are certainly questions about the Prime Minister's conflict of interests and a decision is made that he has the green light to proceed. That in those cases, we're going to keep this ethics committee, we're going to keep members of Parliament, we're going to keep Canadians in the dark, and all that will be left for you to do is to do your digging, and if you stumble across something or you find something, well, then there's a process. But until then, unless that happens, effectively, too bad, so sad. Now, they may characterize it other ways, but that is what they are doing. That's the consequence of not adopting the sub-amendment brought forward by Mr. Barrett, which is their position, the Liberal members of Parliament on this committee, their position. And it begs the question, why? Which I keep asking. And I continue to invite Liberal members opposite to help me better understand what the rationale is, because it isn't too cumbersome, saying that it's not the way that it works, that there's the process of going through the ethics commissioner, totally, again, inadequate for the reasons that I've outlined. And so, without any further explanation or beyond what are totally disingenuous, illegitimate, inadequate, not persuasive explanations, the inference that I am left with drawing is that Well, first of all, that we have a Prime Minister's office that really isn't interested in transparency. They've created the facade of transparency, but on matters that are clearly material to whoever the Prime Minister is involved or engaged in matters in which he has a conflict of interest, the posture, position of the PMO is to effectively tell this committee to tell Canadians to pound sand. Now, they won't say that, they won't use those terms, but that is one thing that we are learning from this debate and the resistance that we're seeing from Liberal MPs, no doubt based upon the input from the Prime Minister's office. But the other thing that, putting aside just the general contempt, really, for transparency that we're seeing, it raises questions about how robustly this ethics screen is in fact being applied. How many times has the ethics screen not been applied when it should be applied? Maybe never. Maybe it has always been applied when it should be. But perhaps not. And if the Prime Minister's office is so confident that everything is above board and has been applied robustly, then show us the analysis. Show us the times that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of Privy Council signed off and said, no, the Prime Minister can proceed. There isn't a sufficient conflict of interest here. Now, I don't have a lot of confidence in this ethics screen and the way in which it is being administered. As a starting point, we have an ethics screen to avoid conflicts of interest on the part of the Prime Minister being administered by persons who have a conflict of interest, insofar as the clerk and the Chief of Staff both serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. So they're not independent, regardless of the extent to which they're acting fully in good faith and trying to apply the ethics screen. They're not independent. They're in a conflict. That's a problem, but it's a problem that seems to be accepted by the ethics commissioner. I'll concede that. Okay. So it underscores why, all the more, there needs to be some level of transparency. We have no mechanism to know when and how often the screen is being invoked or not invoked on matters in which there have been red flags. In fact, before this committee undertook study in the fall on reviewing the Conflict of Interest Act, we were left completely in the dark. We had no idea how it was being used. We got some answers as to how many times, 13, that the tool had been used and an analysis had been prepared. We got a copy of the tool, but we have no other information. And of course, where matters that warrant likely scrutiny or could warrant scrutiny from this committee are not in those cases where the screen has been invoked, because it's been invoked. And so the Prime Minister has no involvement in the matter. It's on matters where he is involved. Now, some of those areas could be gray areas. Some of them could be areas where he has a blatant conflict of interest, but for whatever reason, the clerk of the Privy Council and the Chief of Staff signed off and said, go ahead, Prime Minister. Whatever it is, and then there could be, and likely are other instances where the answer, any reasonable objective person would say, well, no, in fact, they got it right. It shouldn't be invoked. But all Mr. Barrett's sub-amendment is saying is, show us those times. Be transparent. If you're so confident in the ethics screen, if this is the answer, the solution to guarding against a prime minister from making decisions in which he has a conflict of interest, a prime minister who doesn't have any ordinary number of conflicts of interest by the standpoint of former prime ministers, but the most conflicts of interest because of the roles that he played prior to becoming elected to this place and serving as prime minister. And we have, as a backdrop to all of this, of course, documented cases where the Prime Minister has met with Brookfield, notwithstanding that those companies or executives were executives of companies listed in Schedule A. So it's not as if, or I would rephrase it, based on everything that we have seen over the past year, there have been multiple instances where the Prime Minister has not abided by the advice of the Ethics Commissioner, being to stay away from Brookfield. In fact, he's done the opposite in several instances, which again raises the question, how many times has this screen not been invoked on matters relating to Brookfield and other conflicts that the Prime Minister's declared and does have? And so it's quite disappointing that Liberals are not inclined or are being directed by the Prime Minister's office not to support Mr. Barrett's sub-amendment. It does raise questions about exactly what the Prime Minister's office is hiding. And by hiding, I mean they are hiding. They're hiding these reports from this committee and from Canadians. Why? Why? I will say, just before I got to this committee, I was in question period, and I put forward some questions to the government on a matter involving $200 million tax dollars that have gone to a company called Maritime Launch Services for a so-called spaceport in Nova Scotia. And I asked some very straightforward questions today about how it is that the Liberals entered into a lease with a nearly bankrupt company, a company whose independent auditor's report specifically flagged or questioned whether that company, Maritime Launch Services, was a going concern. that the Liberals nonetheless proceeded to enter into a lease for a so-called spaceport with an early bankrupt company. They entered into the lease in March of this year, but backdated the lease to April 1st of 2025. They backdated it by a full year without any work being undertaken by Maritime Launch Services, no proof of value for tax dollars, even though Maritime Launch Services got $20 million because the lease had been backdated. When I say no work, all you have to do is look at the site that consists of a poorly designed concrete slab and a gravel parking lot. But the Liberals handed Maritime Launch Services $20 million tax dollars by backdating the lease. And then we find out that the chair of the board immediately upon the lease being entered into, in which $20 million was funneled to Maritime Launch Services, decides to sell 3 million shares that were previously worthless or nearly worthless and rakes in $1.8 million. $1.8 million. And you would ask, normally in the private sector, there'd be a lockup agreement in place to prevent exactly that sort of thing from happening. Why the Liberals didn't insist upon a lockup agreement is beyond me, other than that the whole thing is one big scheme, pump and dump scheme, in which an insider got pretty rich. $1.8 million is it's a pretty good deal if you can get it with worthless shares. But suddenly you get $20 million for work that was never done to bail out your nearly bankrupt company, and here are now my shares. I'm selling them. I'll rake in a cool $1.8 million. So those are, I think, for an opposition party, the official opposition, those are the types of questions that Canadians want answers to. That in terms of holding the government to account, that is necessary to get answers to questions like that. As to why $200 million went to a company that doesn't own land, it's making a 1,300% profit off Crown land that they're then flipping back to the federal government for a concrete slab and a gravel pit in respect of a lease that's backdated by a year for no work, no value, in which the chair of the board walks off with $1.8 million after selling shares immediately after his nearly bankrupt company got a $20 million cash infusion from Mark Carney's Liberals. And what I saw in the House was the Minister of Natural Resources, he laughing about the matter. He thought it was funny. The member for Cape Breton, Parliamentary Secretary, Mike Kellaway, in answer to a follow-up question from Greg McLean, called it a conspiracy theory. Now, I cite this in terms of what happened in the House a little over an hour ago as an illustration, as one illustration of how these Liberals operate. The complete and utter contempt that they have for accountability. The extent to which they go to gaslight, to dismiss and laugh off what on the surface appears to be cronyism and corruption of the worst kind in the case of this so-called space pad. Now, bringing it back to the sub-amendment put forward by Mr. Barrett, we see a lot of the same gaslighting at the last meeting of this committee. A lot of the same approach, which is to effectively thumb their nose at transparency and accountability. And I know that the Prime Minister and those who repeat the talking points provided by the Prime Minister's office, whether they be parliamentary secretaries or backbench Liberal MPs, often call this Canada's new government. But it's the same old Liberal government, the same old Liberal approach, the same old Liberal government that has a long history of cronyism, conflict, and corruption. I sat on this committee in the last Parliament, and the litany of scandals surrounding the same old Liberal government is too much to keep track of. It was endless. It was endless. You know, there's a reason Justin Trudeau left office with, upon him announcing that he was resigning in January of 2026, had an approval rating in the range of 15 or 16%, the lowest approval rating of any Prime Minister in 35 years. The highest approval rating was not 17%. If that's a high approval rating, I think Mr. Al-Soud, who worked in that office, thought that was such a great approval rating. Well, I mean, 17% is 17%. It was, he couldn't be more out of touch if he thought that Justin Trudeau was popular in January of 2026. He most certainly wasn't. But it doesn't matter other than to say that there was a reason why he was unpopular, and that was because of a litany of corruption, conflicts, and scandals surrounding his government. And for Canada's so-called new Prime Minister, new government, there was an opportunity for a reset, to do things differently. But it's been more of the same. More of the same when we have a Prime Minister who 2 days after the federal election meets with an executive who's listed on one of the Brookfield companies in which the Prime Minister has a conflict of interest. More of the same when we have a Prime Minister who a month later met with the CEO of Brookfield Infrastructure in Washington. More of the same when we have a Prime Minister who met with those connected to Brookfield in New York City and London. More of the same when we have a Prime Minister who met with none other than the Chief Operating Officer of Brookfield in the Prime Minister's office alone. The Chief Operating Officer of Brookfield, who came before this committee and acknowledged, quite appropriately so, that given the Prime Minister's extensive stock options and deferred share units with Brookfield, but, quote, as the value of Brookfield increases, the value of those instruments increase. In other words, when Brookfield does well, Mark Carney does well. Well, if Brookfield does well, if it is the case that when Brookfield does well, but Mark Carney does well, then we sure deserve to know those times that the Prime Minister has been involved in decisions involving Brookfield. We need to know those times that sufficient red flags have been raised, likely about Brookfield, that warrants an analysis, but the Prime Minister proceeds to be involved in those decisions. I suspect the reason that the Prime Minister's office doesn't want this committee to see when they have given the Prime Minister the green light is because it wouldn't look good for them. It would raise questions about how robustly this ethics screen is in fact being applied. To what extent the Prime Minister, in fact, is recusing himself or not being involved, being shielded from decisions related to Brookfield. And that's really what is going on here. You know, they can come up with all kinds of excuses, but that's what's going on here. They don't want Canadians to know all of the times the Prime Minister is making decisions related to Brookfield in which he has a conflicts of interest because he stands to make millions when Brookfield does well. They don't want Canadians to see that. They don't want Canadians to know about when that's happening. They want Canadians to be kept in the dark. We need transparency. We need sunlight. We need to know. That's what the sub-amendment provides for. And I'm hoping that Liberal MPs, upon further reflection, will maybe do something other than take the orders of the Prime Minister's office and support Mr. Barrett's very reasonable sub-amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Alsuit, on the sub-amendment, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Out of respect for the work we could be doing here today, and perhaps because I don't enjoy the sound of my own voice as much as others do, I won't take up as much time as some of my colleagues have. We've been having this conversation now at seemingly no end, and the saddest part is that what's being proposed in the sub-amendment does nothing but create a parallel process to track decisions that were not assessed to require a screen. To Mr. Cooper's note on the something that is missing and on certain points we've heard previously pertaining to compromise, the motion with our amendments will provide the committee with a report that outlines situations where the screen was applied and updates on how the process is completed to determine whether one is needed. If there are, as they spend so much of this House's time and resources saying, problems, that should be more than enough to identify it. When we do get to doing some work in this committee, we hear from witnesses across the board who tell us how rigorous our system is. And every minute we spend in this room having this conversation, what certain people here are saying is that they don't have faith in those institutions. I said this on Monday, Chair, and I'll say it again. I've been on this committee for over a month now, and I've heard nothing but long rants turned into clips. This is the time we could be spending on incredibly important studies, studies that were collectively agreed upon as matters of utmost importance. In fact, I recall distinctly being told on Monday, don't worry, Mr. Alsuit, we'll be able to get back to doing that work on Thursday. We could be using today's meeting to do some work. We could be making use of the time we have today, move forward on what we all collectively know to be of tremendous value. And yet here we are, again, going on long rants for the sake of generating clips. All I ask is that we get to work. We're here. Madame Gaudreau nous dit qu'elle veut faire du vrai travail.
Ms. Gaudreau has said that she wants to do real work, and we're here. Let's do it.
And then in the same breath continue on with rants preventing us from that work. They will now go on, I have no doubt, but Canadians are far smarter than these members seem to think. They see through this. This is disappointing. That's all I'll add on this. And to Mr. Cooper's note on approval ratings, perhaps he could enlighten us as to where the Prime Ministers currently sit. And to his comment on my time in government, I'll echo the kind words of Mr. Barrett this past Monday. Feel free to follow and like. Thank you, Chair. Merci.
Okay, thank you, Mr. El-Soud. On the sub-amendment, Monsieur Hardy, sous-amendement.
Je suis toujours très estomaqué d'entendre.
I'm always shocked to hear criticisms coming from my colleague from across the way who's been there for a month. And as all the Liberals has forgotten what's happened in the past few months and years, and he's now quite emotional, stating that we're losing time. And he had a well-prepared text that he had to read off his iPad. But he's forgetting that the Liberals spoke for 24 hours before they got a majority government, and then they shut down the committee. That's them. And now he's shocked by the fact that we're trying to understand why we want information, and he's talking about wasting time. My colleagues across the way can't talk about wasting time. We heard 73 minutes of a monologue. Nobody spent money on that. Nobody bought tickets for it, but yet we have to be there. We have to watch them. One MP, 73 minutes. So, come on. Let's be reasonable with these comments, and you can't call people to order when you can't organize yourselves. I want people to understand what's going on here. I'm not going to go through the entire document, but the document is incredible for the screen. I'm going to give some comments on it. I want people to understand what we're referring to. What's the information that we're seeking? And we want to know why they don't want to give us this information. So it goes as follows. As I said, the Prime Minister says that the Ethics Commissioner and I, and speaking as the Prime Minister, agreed on an ethics screen, which is an appropriate measure to ensure compliance, so they think it's great. Our opinion doesn't matter because they know the absolute truth, so it can prevent any issues. We think it's not the case. Canadians don't think it's the case, but it says here, black on white, that it will prevent any way of favorizing my holdings or my assets, Brookfield Corporation, and any other company that Brookfield owns, to my knowledge. And this is where we see these yes maybes. So he talked about the ones that he's aware of. He talked about his assets in blind trust. He's no longer aware of it, so there's a little loophole. So for when he put in place his blind trust, and we talked about, and it includes Annex A, but we don't have access to it. So this screen would stop him from giving a preference to any of those companies. I hate wasting time in life, so I will be brief. I absolutely hate it, and the Liberals showed me again just how much I hate wasting people's time. The screen will be administered by the Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council. Chief of Staff, employee of the Prime Minister. Clerk of the Privy Council, employee of the Prime Minister. So there's a second loophole. So the first is to my knowledge. The second is that it's two of my direct employees, me as the Prime Minister. So this will guarantee that I will never be informed of decision-making processes that have an impact on these businesses or benefits these businesses. But third loophole, I could take part in discussions and decisions of general application. if you're a prime minister, everything is of general application. You're making decisions for the country. So this is a 20-wheel truck-sized loophole. So, that has an impact on a large category of people. Brookfield is a Canadian company that is known for tax evasion, and it will be benefiting from a lot of government decisions, even though they are of general application. So, we were given this document in order to be reassured, but in reading it, I'm far from reassured. In fact, I'm surprised that it was accepted. So, for companies subject to the filter, or the screen rather, that's 103 out of 2,000, by the way. So, is it truly a robust screen if hundreds are not subject to it? So for companies that require special attention, so again, fourth or fifth loophole, I don't even know which one I'm at. So they're saying they're going to focus on those that require a particular attention. Next page. Part A. So things that need to be targeted by the screen. So this is what explains, this includes explanation. Anything linked to Brookfield Management or Stripe, and businesses in Annex A. We don't have Annex A, conflicts of interest, yada yada. This needs to be automatically reviewed by the screen, and there should not be a discussion with a public office holder, or should not be shared with the public office holder. That's step one that should have been implemented, and yet the director of Brookfield came here and said once the Prime Minister was appointed, he spent a day with him in his office. So there shouldn't be any discussions, any meetings, or meetings with subsidiaries. And it's not a subsidiary, it was Brookfield, the director of Brookfield, that was in his office. So they didn't read the document very far, because that's the first thing. Now, regarding funding, the lobbying commissioner came to say that if you're requesting any funding, that's under the lobbying regime. But for known subsidiaries, then you don't have to go through the lobbying mechanism. So, again, another issue. So, in Part A, we're already in troubled waters. Because in the first week even, none of this happened. Second part, elements that require an assessment. So when the two employees of the Prime Minister have to assess a situation. So if they look into the screen, and if it's focused on, or rather, and it's focused on a certain number of industries. But Brookfield takes part in a lot of industries, and decision makers are really focused on all of these industries. So Brookfield just needs to be everywhere, and then will not be impacted in any way by the screen. I won't read all of it, but it is well written. And so an assessment is not required if decisions are made only under the authority of a minister. And I would like to remind the committee that we have a minister that recused himself. Did not recused himself, then voted on something that he should have recused himself from. So that's a minister that we'll be hearing from soon, who saw a potential conflict of interest. And we looked at the definition. If you recuse yourself, it's because you're at a conflict of interest or you're incompetent. He hasn't responded to us yet regarding why he recused himself. So he recused himself, then he defended all of this, and then he voted on the Alto high-speed rail. But his wife is VP. So with the screen, if decisions are under the direct authority of a minister, well, the screen does not need to be used. Is that supposed to make me trust the system? Imagine if a minister, the Minister of Finance, number 2 in the country, recuses himself, but the document says if it's under a minister, no problem, we're protected. Those listening might think, perhaps there's a problem. And now sectors requiring particular attention. And now this is where things get interesting. We'll need to be careful with certain industries. Property. Brookfield is directly linked to that, big time. There are announcements every week regarding billions of dollars invested. Mortgage insurance. Transport. Nuclear expansion. Brookfield, yet again. The screen was not activated, we don't know, but we're hearing announcement. Expanding the renewable energies, solar, wind, hydro. These are all announcements that were made in the major projects. We're looking at all of these files. So, what's the screen supposed to do? If we heard, yeah, there were potential issues, there were problems that were blocked because of the use of the screen, and the Prime Minister's interests would be significantly impacted, but no. We're hearing announcements, billion-dollar announcements every week that should be covered by the ethics screen. And I'll end here because these are questions that need to be asked, how we need to ask them. So any modifications to fiscal policy are generally considered as having a general application and or benefiting a category of people. Most of these modifications should not be covered by an assessment or an evaluation. And I have a picture. I looked at the analysis of that fiscal policy. Listen to what I'm going to read now. The Liberal government applied these fiscal policies that are supposed to be of general application, not covered by the screen. Funding for clean economy. The bill offers generous tax credits for clean energy, clean tech, and carbon capture programs. Those measures are funding renewable energy and the Green Transition Fund owned by Brookfield. So you might look at that and think, well, if it's of general application, I have a right to these policies, but this general application is still benefiting in a significant way the Prime Minister's company. Now, another bill that has a deduction for productivity, offering deductions for new spending in capital, and that it reduces taxable incomes linked with large property infrastructure projects. So another thing that advantages Brookfield. And I'm going to end on this because I don't want to waste any time. And I'm sure my colleague is very interested by what I have to say. What we're asking is not complicated. We just want access to these documents. It's supposed to be a 2-pager. We know that we'll have access to one of our requests. When the screen is used, we're supposed to be notified. At the committee, we also want to know when an analysis was carried out and a decision was made not to apply the screen. It's not complicated. There are 2 choices. Either you don't have the right documents and you do these analyses on a napkin, and this happened recently, and the finance minister stated talking about a $1 billion project created on the corner of a napkin, and that's a problem. I think if you're doing that, we should be aware of it. Second option, you're not carrying out these analyses. And that leads us to believe that there are things that are being hidden. So if these 2 direct employees of the Prime Minister are carrying out an analysis and they're not doing it on a napkin, you should have these documents. Why not share them? We're supposed to be neutral. We can look at them here as a team. And as Mr. Al-Soud said, we'll do the work. That's all we want to do. Give us the documents and let's do the work. But they're saying, no, stop asking for them because we're writing them on the corner of a napkin or because we want to hide the information. Why refuse us access to this information? You're accusing me of wanting clips, but people, since I started sharing these clips, are more interested in what we're doing. They're laughing across the room, but I'm interested in what's happening, and people are interested. I hate that taxpayer dollars are being spent, and they're not being explained how this money is being spent. I don't agree that everything is going well. People come to see me every weekend. They're saying, I'm not making ends meet. I can't pay for gas. I can't pay for food. But I'm looking at the spending of the Prime Minister, $520,000 to eat on an airplane with great wine and food. People are skipping meals because they can't make ends meet, and then they're laughing at us across the room because we're asking questions. All we want is access to documents. We want to be able to work on all of this. We want to be able to make these clips and educate people so that they can make an opinion. I'll say it here. I said it in an interview. I've said it before. I had a job before this. The day that people tell me that I'm not representing them anymore, I'll do something else. But they have to make the decisions with the information that we give them. You're laughing at us. You're telling us that we're wasting time, but you have monologued. We were there 24 hours listening to you. Sad. And when we ask for something that should exist, you're telling us that we're asking for too much. Why are you refusing to give us this information? That's one of my questions. If there was an assessment, it's because somebody looked at this and thought, maybe we should do an analysis, see if there's a conflict of interest, and then we can decide whether or not there was one. So, if the process was started, it's because there was a potential conflict of interest. So we're not in the wrong. We're not extreme. We're not conspiracy theorists. If the process was triggered, it's because somebody on your side thought that it would be a good idea to look into it. We just want to know when and what the circumstances are. So maybe you should be humble and give information to Canadians. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Monsieur Hardy, Madame Lapointe, vous avez la parole sur le sous-amendement.
Ms. Lapointe, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to hear that Ms. Gaudreau wants us to move forward, wants us to work. Please don't cut me off. What I'm hearing in my writing, people are very concerned by what's happening with our southern neighbors. People are concerned with what's happening throughout the world, and they're quite proud of what the Prime Minister is doing, the agreements that he is working on, knowing that we are a middle power, that we are signing trade agreements so that we're less vulnerable, less dependent on our southern neighbors. We have a study on AI that we can do before the end of the summer. There's also a study that was tabled by Leslie Church regarding price-fixing algorithms. We could also study the Privacy Act. When Michael Sabia and Marc-André Blanchard came to speak to us, I know that you weren't here. It was Luc Thériault who was here. I don't know if you were able to read the blues. When they were here, Michael Sabia and Marc-André Blanchard, as I said, I would have preferred to hear from them from the start. They convinced me that the system works. I understand that we can have different opinions, but I believe that those people, those senior public officials, they've convinced me that they're doing their jobs. The Prime Minister has a blind trust. Blind. There's an additional screen. And so Michael Sabia and Marc-André Blanchard are responsible for the application of the screen. I think it's enough. I trust Michael Sabia, I trust Marc-André Blanchard, and I trust their work. And so, Chair, I would ask for us to vote on the amendment. Thank you. And then I would ask for us to vote on the motion.
J'apprécie votre déclaration.
Thank you, Ms. Lapointe, but we still have names, or we still have people who would like to speak to the amendment. And we have to move on with the list before we vote. Mr. Cooper.
On the sub-amendment,
Yeah, well,
Mr. Chang, you're next.
on the sub-amendment, I have to say that it is quite rich for, in this case, Mr. Al-Sood to assert himself as the arbiter of what constitutes a waste of time for this committee and what doesn't. He characterized my submissions as a rant, that I was wasting the committee's time, calling on the Liberals opposite to support a sub-amendment that would provide transparency about whether the Prime Minister's ethics screen is being appropriately invoked. Now, if the member opposite thinks that's a waste of time, then I guess it's par for the course with these Liberals who think that transparency, who think accountability is one big waste of time. It speaks to the absolute arrogance of these Liberals. It underscores their total contempt for accountability, their total contempt for the oversight role of this committee. And it's ironic, given the fact that we had to put up with more than 24 hours of filibustering from Liberal MPs to block accountability with respect to ALTO, and the Minister of Finance's apparent conflict of interest in respect of ALTO, in which he introduced, spoke on, and voted on legislation to give billions of dollars to ALTO, notwithstanding that his spouse is a VP at ALTO. When we called on the finance minister to come before this committee to answer some questions about what, on its face, is a conflict of interest, we had to listen to 24 hours, it seemed like 100 hours, of filibustering from Liberal MPs. I didn't hear Mr. Al-Sood talk about a waste of time at that point. I didn't hear any Liberal MPs talk about it being a waste of time. But now that Conservatives are insisting that Mr. Barrett's sub-amendment be adopted, or imploring Liberal MPs to join us in getting the sub-amendment passed so that we can have transparency around the ethics screen. Now, somehow that's a waste of time. So, again, accountability, transparency for the Liberals, they treat it as one big waste of time, one big inconvenience. And that was also the position of Madame Lapointe. She said, I don't really care about transparency, and I'm paraphrasing her, but that's what she said. I don't really care about transparency. I don't need transparency because, as she said, I trust the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Mr. Blanchard, and the Clerk of Privy Council, Mr. Sabia. I trust them. Now, I'm not going to in any way impugn the integrity of either Mr. Sabia or Mr. Blanchard, but to simply say I trust them, I don't think that most Canadians would consider that to be adequate, to be good enough. It's not simply good enough to say we trust you to make decisions on a matter that relates to Prime Minister and conflicts of interest. And I've got to say, when Mr. Al-Sood talks about a big waste of time and the fact that we had to, in this committee, endure 24 hours of filibustering by the Liberals as they dragged proceedings out. They said that the minister couldn't come on May the 6th, the week of May the 6th, that he could in fact come on May the 23rd, and now we're in the week of May 23rd, and we were told on Monday that no, the Minister of Finance can't come before this committee until sometime in June. I can't recall exactly what date, but it's in about 2 weeks from now that he'll finally make himself available to answer questions about his apparent conflict of interest in relation to Alto. So the Liberals talk about wasting time. They talk about the work that this committee could be doing. Well, maybe they should ask themselves why it is that they put this committee through a 24-hour filibuster to provide us with a window that they claimed the minister would be available to come before this committee to answer questions about an apparent conflict of interest. And now he's not coming for another 2 weeks. Is that did they put us through a big waste of time? For Liberals who claim that they value the work of this committee so much, they sure don't seem very excited or enthusiastic about having the minister come to this committee to answer questions about a conflict of interest. Because again, for Liberals, transparency, accountability is just one big waste of time. They think they're above the rules. They think they're above the law. They think nothing applies to them. Oh, they will lecture, they will speak in the most condescending and sanctimonious ways possible. But when it comes to conflicts of interest and questions about the Prime Minister and the ethics screen, they will act holier than thou, all the while basically thumbing their nose, saying the hell with providing transparency. And I guess I'll just say I won't accept any lectures from a Liberal member's opposite talking about what is a waste of this committee's time and what isn't a waste of this committee's time. I know that Mr. Al-Sood and Madame Lapointe listed a number of items that they thought that this committee should study. I don't have any objection to the items that they listed, but none of the items listed actually deal with the core function of this committee, which is to provide oversight. To provide oversight around the Lobbying Act and the Conflict of Interest Act. Instead, we saw 24-hour filibusters, a date that the minister was supposed to come when he didn't come to answer questions about a conflict of interest. And I know Ms. Church, who thinks this is so funny, said, well, Minister of Finance is going to be there at the Committee of the Whole for 4 hours. He was at the committee for 4 hours, and I think he didn't answer a single question in the 4 hours that he was there. In fact, I asked him some questions about the spaceport, why, for example, the lease was backdated, and he said that maybe he would put me in touch with some astronauts. I mean, that was his explanation. That it was all very exciting work that is being done to launch a spaceport, and maybe he'd put me in touch with some astronauts. Why am I attacking the space industry? No, that was his question. That was his answer. Instead of addressing the very real issue of $20 million being funneled to maritime launch services on a backdated lease to bail out a nearly bankrupt company with a board chair who's been fined $100,000 for securities infractions, who walked away with $1.8 million after he sold 3 million shares after the $20 million infusion of cash. The minister's response is that that's an attack on the space industry? That's the best that he could give in the way of an answer? Give me a break. I mean, it just speaks to their contempt. And I hope that when the minister comes before this committee, if he comes, I hope he doesn't find another excuse not to come before this committee. We'll see. That he sure does a better job in answering questions than he did for 4 hours at the Committee of the Whole, where he provided no answers, where he treated the process as one big joke in answer to very specific questions about how this government is spending taxpayers' money. And I spoke about the Prime Minister's conflicts with respect to Brookfield, the litany of conflicts that he has. And I would also note that, as Mr. Bieber, the chief operating officer of Brookfield, conceded that when Brookfield does well, the Prime Minister does well. Well, in the last year that these Liberals have been in office, Brookfield has done very well under this government. This is a Liberal government that has fast-tracked a Brookfield-owned LNG project. This is a Liberal government that handed $500 million tax dollars to a foreign space agency, a European space agency. I know the Prime Minister calls himself a European, so maybe that's how he justifies sending $500 million tax dollars to the European Space Agency. That is connected and owned by Brookfield.
Oh, Brookfield.
And then there's the multi-billion-dollar investment in carbon capture with Pathways Alliance. Now, the premier company, carbon capture company associated with Pathways Alliance is none other than Entropy. And who owns Entropy? Brookfield.
Oh.
Of course, Brookfield. And
I was not ready for that.
what fund in Brookfield invested $300 million in Entropy? The Global Transition Fund 1. Who set up the Global Transition Fund 1? The Prime Minister did. And who stands to make tens of millions of dollars in carried interest payments, aka future bonus pay from Global Transition Fund 1? Mark Carney. He stands to make tens of millions. So here you have a multi-billion-dollar investment from Mark Carney's government into Entropy for carbon capture that is owned by Brookfield, by the very fund that Mark Carney stands to make tens of millions of dollars in future bonus pay from. And Madame Lapointe, with the greatest respect, says we should just trust Mr. Sabia and Mr. Blanchard. What we see, I guess, is a prime minister who maybe, in a lot of respects, is sort of just ignoring this ethics screen altogether, and is landing in a very, very good position as far as all the money that is being doled out from his government to various Brookfield companies and interests, including interests that benefit the very investment fund that he stands to make tens of millions of dollars from. And so I provide that background to say that Mr. Barrett's sub-amendment does not come in a vacuum. It comes in the face of a lot of conflicts that the Prime Minister has with Brookfield, a lot of taxpayer dollars that are going to Brookfield, tax dollars going to Brookfield that ultimately benefit the Prime Minister and his future bonus pay and his stock options. And while it comes in the face of a Prime Minister who has basically said that he's quite comfortable helping to see that Brookfield does very well because he does very well. And all we're asking for is for the Prime Minister's office and the Clerk of Privy Council to show us their analysis of when they think there isn't a conflict of interest in relation to Brookfield. And in that respect, this sub-amendment is actually very, very narrow in scope because there's a whole lot of other areas to explore around Brookfield, around how the Prime Minister is benefiting directly or indirectly, and that what I cited, whether it be the fast tracking of the LNG project, $500 million to the European Space Agency, the multi-billion-dollar investment that is going to benefit Entropy, which is going to benefit Brookfield, and specifically the Global Transition Fund. I mean, all of those things fall outside of this issue of the ethics screen, perhaps or perhaps not, because I really do wonder why it was the ethics screen, for example, was it flagged? Was it flagged when the government announced a multi-billion-dollar investment in carbon capture with Pathways Alliance, with the beneficiary being Entropy? Was there an analysis done on that? Was there a red flag? Was there an analysis done? Did Sabia and Blanchard say to the Prime Minister, no problem here. We'll make a multi-billion-dollar investment that benefits your investment fund, that benefits your bonus pay? And if an analysis was done and that was the decision, then there's some questions to be asked. And if there was no analysis done, then the question is why? Why wasn't an analysis done? To what extent are things and matters involving the Prime Minister, where he has a conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest, being missed by this tool that we were told is the be-all and end-all by Blanchard and Sabia? I would ask the same question about the European Space Agency. $500 million benefiting Brookfield. Was it flagged? Was an analysis done? And if the decision was made that the Prime Minister had no conflict there, then again, there's some questions that need to be answered. And if an analysis wasn't done, well, that raises questions about what kind of a tool, if at all, this tool around the ethics screen really is. And so for the Liberals to say that all of this is one big waste of time, I'll tell you, demanding transparency, working to see that this committee fulfill its responsibility of providing oversight of the most conflicted Prime Minister in Canadian history is not a waste of time. It is responsibility of this committee and every member of this committee, and it's a responsibility that I certainly will not shirk as a member of the official opposition. The core responsibility of the official opposition is to hold the government to account. That's what we're doing here. Now, it may not be what Liberal members on the committee necessarily like to see or like to hear, but it is our core responsibility, and that's not a waste of time. And so we're going to continue to press this matter. We did have benefit of Mr. Al-Soud and Madame Lapointe making submissions. And I respect the points they make to the extent that they've said, well, they consider accountability to be a transparency to be a waste of time, and that we'll just trust Mr. Sabia and Mr. Blanchard. But I guess between both of those submissions, what was totally missing was any explanation for what the problem with Mr. Barrett's sub-amendment is. I've spoken at length for the merits of this, but what I have not heard from Liberals opposite is exactly what it is they object to with Mr. Barrett's sub-amendment. I know Mr. El-Soud stated that that where the ethics screen was triggered, that would be, those reports would be provided to this committee.
Just a couple more minutes, Mr.
And I guess all I can say is I certainly am aware that that's what would be provided to this committee. But that's not the issue. The issue is what is not provided to this committee. That is the issue. And what we have not heard is an explanation as to what it is or why they don't want this committee to see those reports. And I know Madame Lapointe would like us to just trust Mr. Sabia and Mr. Blanchard. I know that she would like us to somehow say there's all is well, nothing to see here, no questions to be asked, because supposedly the Prime Minister signing all of these agreements and making us less dependent on our sovereign neighbor, whatever that's supposed to mean. I thought he was the great deal maker, the guy who could get a deal with our largest trading partner done. It's only a $33 trillion economy, but he hasn't done very well in that regard. I know Mexico's at the negotiating table. Where's Canada? We have all kinds of jobs, over 2 million jobs that are directly tied to a trade agreement with the United States, and the master negotiator is AWOL.
Gonna have to cut you off there, Mr. Cooper. We've run out of resources, so I appreciate your intervention, Mr. El-Soud. Get your hard hat, your coveralls, and your work boots on for next week, because we're going to be coming back on Monday and dealing with the lobbying report. Okay, so the Lobbying Act study, so you make sure you get your hard hat, your coveralls, and your work boots on, and roll up those sleeves and get to work, sir. Okay, meeting's adjourned.